I never thought the quietest night of the year would become the loudest moment of my life. On New Year's night, when families gather and promises feel fresh, mine walked out and left me sitting in the dark. I was certain nothing new waited for me anymore. I was wrong. What happened at midnight changed everything I believed about family, dignity, and starting over at my age. Stay with me till the end, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe for more. The house felt different the moment the front door closed behind them. The laughter they'd carried in all evening vanished, leaving a hollow silence that pressed against my ears. The decorations still sparkled, cheap silver streamers drooping from the doorway, a plastic clock ticking loudly on the wall. I sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in my lap, listening to their car pull away. I told myself they'd come back. They always did. This time they didn't. Earlier that evening, I'd tried to make things nice. At 82, my body moved slower, but my heart still believed effort mattered. I'd cooked what I could manage, set out plates I'd saved for years, even lit the vanilla candles my daughter once said smelled like home. They arrived late, already distracted, phones glowing in their hands. My son barely looked up when he hugged me. My daughter wrinkled her nose the moment she stepped inside, glancing around as if she were inspecting a motel room she planned to leave soon. We sat together, but it felt like sitting beside strangers on a bus. Conversations skimmed the surface. They talked about parties they might attend later, friends waiting across town, plans that didn't include me. I tried to laugh at the right moments, to keep my voice light. When the clock neared 11, my daughter sighed loudly and said the house felt stuffy. She cracked a joke about the smell, waving her hand in front of her face. My son chuckled. I smiled too, though something tightened in my chest. I'd lived in that house for 40 years. It carried the scent of old books, lemon, polish, and memories. To me, it smelled like a life fully lived. To them, it was embarrassing. My daughter leaned close and whispered that I should think about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere appropriate. She said it like advice, but it landed like a verdict. Before I could answer, they were already gathering their coats. They told me they'd be back after midnight. Said they didn't want to miss the countdown downtown. My son kissed my cheek, distracted, already half gone. The door shut, and with it went the last warmth in the room. I waited. I kept the television on low, watching strangers cheer in other cities. My phone stayed silent on the table beside me. Midnight crept closer, each second stretching longer than the last. As the final minute arrived, I stood alone and counted down with the television. 10, 9, 8. My voice echoed faintly off the walls. When the clock struck 12, fireworks burst on the screen and people hugged, kissed, celebrated. I whispered Happy New Year to an empty room. That was when something inside me shifted. Not sadness, exactly. Clarity. I looked around and saw my life reduced to something they tolerated. Something they planned to escape from. I realized I'd been shrinking myself for years, apologizing for my space, my needs, my presence. I'd raised my children to stand tall, yet somewhere along the way, I'd learned to bow. Sitting there at midnight, alone but awake in a way I hadn't been for decades, I decided I was done, disappearing. I turned off the television and walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. Each item held a story they didn't know or care to hear. In the bedroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was thin and white, my face lined, but my eyes looked sharper than they had in years. I spoke out loud, testing the sound of my own resolve. I said I deserved peace. I said I deserved respect. That night, while the rest of the world celebrated new beginnings, I opened a folder I'd ignored for too long. Inside were documents, notes from meetings I'd once postponed, plans I'd been afraid to make. I didn't rush. I read slowly, thoughtfully. The fear that once stopped me felt smaller now, almost silly. They thought I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to choose. They were wrong. Sometime after 1 a.m, my phone buzzed. A short message from my daughter. We're staying out. Don't wait up. I read it twice, then set the phone face down. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes after a storm passes, when you realize you're still standing. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last fireworks fade from the sky. By the time dawn crept in, pale and quiet, I'd made a decision that would change the rest of my life. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was solid, like the ground beneath my feet. I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold, but I knew one thing with certainty. I wouldn't let anyone make me feel small again, especially in my own home. Morning arrived without apology. Pale light slipped through the curtains as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the night before hadn't quietly redrawn the boundaries of my life. I slept little, but I didn't feel tired. Instead, I felt alert, like someone who'd been asleep for years and had finally opened their eyes. When I heard my phone buzz again around 8, I let it ring. Whoever it was could wait. For once, I chose myself first. I made breakfast slowly, deliberately. Toast, eggs, tea brewed a little stronger than usual. The simple routine grounded me. As I ate, I replayed moments from the past few years that I'd brushed aside. Little comments, small dismissals, the way my opinions were met with polite nods instead of real attention. None of it had seemed serious on its own. Together, they told a story I'd refused to read until now. The phone buzzed again. This time I glanced at the screen. My son, I answered. He sounded groggy, irritated, like I'd interrupted something important. He asked if I was upset about them leaving early. I told him I wasn't upset. I was finished. There was a pause on the line, the kind that stretches thin when someone doesn't hear what they expect. He laughed awkwardly and said, I was being dramatic. That word landed heavy. Dramatic. As if loneliness at my age were a performance. I told him calmly that I'd made some decisions and would explain later. He sighed, said we'd talk when everyone was less emotional. After we hung up, I realized something else had changed. His disappointment no longer scared me. For years, I'd measured my choices by how they'd react. That scale no longer mattered. Later that morning, my daughter showed up unannounced. She stepped inside, eyes scanning the room the same way they always did, like she was searching for flaws. She said she'd come to check on me. I told her I was fine. She frowned, then launched into a familiar speech about my age, about safety, about how hard it was for them to worry about me. I listened quietly, then asked her a simple question. When was the last time you worried about how I felt? She blinked, caught off guard. She said feelings weren't the point. Practicality was. I nodded and said that was exactly the problem. The house, she repeated, wasn't suitable anymore. She mentioned smells again, clutter, how embarrassed she felt bringing friends over. That was when I told her I wouldn't be staying there much longer. Her eyes lit up, relief flashing across her face. She started talking excitedly about facilities she'd researched, places with scheduled meals and activities. I let her finish, then corrected her. I wasn't moving into a facility, I was moving into something better, something I'd chosen. Her smile froze. She asked what I meant. I told her I'd already contacted a real estate agent, not to sell for her convenience but to buy for my freedom. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. She asked where the money would come from. I told her from my savings. From the inheritance she and her brother had already spent in their minds. Her voice sharpened. She said I was being reckless, that I was punishing them over one bad night. I told her this wasn't about punishment, it was about dignity. She crossed her arms and accused me of being selfish. That word used to cut deep. This time it bounced off. I told her I'd spent decades putting others first and that choosing myself now wasn't selfish. It was overdue. She left angry, slamming the door harder than necessary. I sat down afterward, heart pounding, hands trembling slightly. Standing up for myself took more energy than I'd expected, but beneath the nerves was something solid. Pride, maybe, or relief. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't apologized, I hadn't backed down. Over the next few days, I moved quietly, but decisively. I met with an agent who treated me like a client, not a burden. We talked about light, space, places that felt alive instead of managed. I visited homes I never thought I'd consider. Sun-filled apartments near parks, small houses with gardens that didn't need permission to be enjoyed. Every door I walked through felt like a possibility reopening. My children noticed the shift immediately. Messages came in, cautious at first, then more demanding. They wanted details, they wanted assurances, they wanted control disguised as concern. I gave them neither. I told them I was safe, capable, and making choices that made me happy. That word bothered them most. Happy, as if it were unrealistic at my age. One afternoon, while standing in a bright living room overlooking a row of trees, I felt it. A quiet certainty. This was the place. It wasn't grand, it wasn't impressive. It was mine. I imagined mornings with sunlight instead of judgment, evenings with peace instead of tension. I made an offer that day. When the paperwork was signed, something loosened in my chest. For the first time since my husband passed, I wasn't living in a space defined by loss or obligation. I was stepping into something chosen. I didn't tell my children right away. I didn't need their approval to breathe easier. The move happened quickly. I packed what mattered. Photos, books, small things, heavy with meaning. I left behind what I no longer needed, including the guilt I'd been carrying like an heirloom. On my last night in the old house, I stood in the doorway and thanked it silently. It had held my life when I needed it. Now, it was time to hold my own. The first night in my new home was strange in the best possible way. The silence settled differently here, soft, unhurried, and without judgment. The walls weren't familiar yet, but they didn't feel cold. I lit a few candles, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. Outside, the city hummed a distant and unobtrusive melody. I realized I hadn't noticed the world this way in years, always distracted by family needs, always buffering my own desires for someone else's comfort. But now, I could finally notice. I could finally breathe. Sleep came easier than I expected, though I woke at odd hours, turning over memories, little regrets, and moments I'd long ignored. Each one felt softer now, reframed by distance. The sting of being left alone on New Year's night had finally dulled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I'd responded in a way that protected my dignity. I was learning that pain loses much of its edge when paired with action. The next morning, I wandered through the garden I'd chosen, so intentionally a modest patch of earth, yet full of potential. I imagined future mornings with a cup of tea in hand, watching sunlight chase shadows across the grass, and evenings listening to the wind and the birds. It struck me that I had spent decades craving moments exactly like this, but I had always assumed they were luxuries I wasn't allowed. No one had told me I could claim them for myself. I simply hadn't thought to. Messages from my children started to come in, a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and frustration. My son asked why I hadn't consulted him. My daughter demanded to know if I'd spent too much. I didn't respond immediately. I let the questions hang in the air like clouds that eventually drift out of sight. When I finally replied, I was calm, measured, and unapologetic. I told them I wasn't seeking permission. I was seeking peace. That simple statement seemed to rattle them more than any long explanation ever could. As the days passed, I settled into routines that felt luxurious, simply because they were mine. Morning stretches in the garden, leisurely breakfasts, and long walks without any sense of obligation became my new normal. I revisited hobbies I'd abandoned under the weight of parenting and work, painting, reading, even writing letters that no one would ever receive. Each small act reinforced the truth I had discovered on that lonely night. My life didn't belong to anyone else. It belonged to me. Neighbors began to notice me, not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as me. A woman walking her dog paused to comment on the garden. A man jogging past offered a nod that felt like recognition rather than pity. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a caregiver or a relative burdened by responsibility. I was a person, visible in the world, and it felt surprisingly nourishing. One afternoon, while sipping tea on the balcony, my daughter called. I debated answering, but my curiosity won. Her tone was softer than usual, tentative. She wanted to know if I was comfortable, if I had everything I needed. There was no demand, no judgment, just concern. I told her I was more than comfortable. I told her I felt alive again. A pause lingered on the line, and for the first time, I felt no need to fill it with excuses. She said she was happy for me. Though her voice betrayed a lingering unease, that evening I looked around my new apartment and allowed myself to marvel. Light bounced off the pale walls, plants thrived in corners I'd chosen for them, and books waited in uneven towers to be opened. The television played quietly in the background, but I barely noticed it. I realized I hadn't felt this unpressured in years, not even in my youth. It wasn't wealth, status, or convenience that gave me this feeling. It was choice, pure, unadulterated choice. A week into the new year, I began reflecting more deliberately on what truly mattered to me. I had chased approval, security, and harmony for decades, assuming that happiness was something to be deferred until others were satisfied. Now, I saw the error so clearly. Life wasn't about postponing joy. It wasn't about measured sacrifices or curated appearances. Life in its most honest form is about claiming small pieces of contentment wherever and whenever you can. And if those pieces don't fit neatly into the expectations of others, so be it. I decided to celebrate my new beginning quietly. Not a party, not a grand gesture, but a simple ritual to honor my journey. I cooked a meal I loved, not something practical or familiar. I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. I lit candles, played music I adored, and sat down to savor it all. No one was there to watch, to judge, or to interfere. Yet I felt fully seen. I felt fully acknowledged, not by someone else, but by myself. Letters started arriving from distant friends who had lost touch. They asked why they hadn't heard from me, remarking on the change in tone from my last letters. I replied with an honesty I hadn't practiced in decades. I wrote about reclaiming my life, about the decisions that had scared me, and about the quiet courage it took to step into the unknown. Replies trickled back, expressing admiration, curiosity, and occasionally a little envy. And I didn't mind the envy. It meant my actions were real, tangible, and visible. On the second Sunday after the move, I invited my closest neighbor over for coffee. She was a widow like me, someone who understood absence intimately. We talked about everything and nothing. Our conversation was punctuated by laughter, comfortable pauses, and shared silences that felt like warmth. It occurred to me that relationships chosen freely rather than inherited or expected bring so much more nourishment than decades of dutiful family obligation. It wasn't about replacing family. It It was about balancing my life with people who truly mattered. And doing so intentionally. By the end of the month, I could see the changes in myself. My posture was straighter, my steps felt lighter, and my mind was quieter. The constant anxiety that had accompanied me through years of caregiving and compromise had softened. The sting of that lonely New Year's night, which once felt like a deep wound, had transformed into a signal turning point I hadn't recognized at the time. It had forced me to confront what I'd ignored for so long. My own voice, my own desires, my own worth. I realized the truth more clearly than ever. Age isn't a limitation unless you let it be. Loneliness isn't a sentence unless you accept it passively. And choices, even ones made late in life, can redefine the entire landscape of your world. My children's opinions still mattered, but they no longer dictated my happiness. My past didn't vanish, but it didn't control me either. I had finally arrived at a rare state of grace. The knowledge that I could live fully, right here, right now, without waiting for anyone else's approval or recognition. Thanks for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me on this journey. The final weeks in my new home felt like a slow unveiling of life's quiet treasures. I no longer rushed from one obligation to the next. I woke naturally, moved through the day with intention, and allowed myself to notice details I had long ignored: the way sunlight pooled on the kitchen counter, the delicate hum of a refrigerator, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. Life had shrunk and expanded simultaneously, smaller in its noise and obligation, larger in its depth and clarity. I realized that happiness didn't arrive with grand gestures or spectacular events. It crept in, quietly, through choices we make when no one is watching. One morning, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at my reflection. I didn't just see the lines etched by years. I saw resilience, courage, and the subtle spark of curiosity that had never truly left me. I remembered the night my family had left me alone on New Year's. The way silence had initially felt like abandonment. But now, that same silence felt like a canvas. I was no longer defined by others' expectations. I was the painter of my own existence, and for the first time I understood the profound freedom that came with claiming it. Friends began to notice subtle changes in me. They commented on my calmness, my willingness to speak honestly about desires I had previously suppressed. Even my children noticed, though their reactions were mixed. My son admitted that my transformation made him question his own life choices. My daughter hesitated, unsure whether to admire or resent the independence I had cultivated. But I no longer sought validation from anyone. The peace I felt was self-generated, and it was impervious to judgment. I spent evenings reflecting on the years I had devoted to others at the expense of myself. I acknowledged the mistakes, the times I had silenced my voice, the moments I had ignored my needs to maintain harmony, but I didn't dwell on guilt. Instead, I honored those experiences as lessons, proof that growth is possible at any stage. That reclaiming one's life is not only possible, but necessary. I understood that the story of my life didn't belong to anyone but me, and it never had. Midnight on New Year's approached again. A year later, I decided to mark it quietly, alone yet fully present. I lit candles, poured a glass of champagne, and stepped onto the balcony. The city below sparkled with celebration, yet I felt detached from the chaos. Instead of longing for family to gather around me, I embraced the rhythm of my own heart. When the clock struck 12, I raised my glass to myself, to resilience, to courage, to the simple and profound fact that I had chosen myself. Tears came, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude. The months that followed were filled with small victories. I explored hobbies I had shelved, nurtured friendships I had overlooked, and created routines that prioritized joy and curiosity. Gardening became a meditation, painting a channel for emotions I had long ignored, and reading a gateway to worlds I had only imagined. Each day, I added layers to my life that were entirely my own. I understood that wealth, inheritance, or possessions were meaningless without the freedom to shape one's own existence. True richness came from self-determination, from embracing life unapologetically. Conversations with my children evolved slowly. They began to respect the boundaries I had set, even if reluctantly. My daughter started asking for advice rather than issuing commands. My son began sharing his own challenges, seeking connection instead of expecting compliance. I realized that sometimes stepping away, taking a firm stand for oneself, teaches others more than years of obedience ever could. Independence, when modeled courageously, inspires reflection and eventually respect. As spring arrived, I took long walks through the neighborhood, noticing life in its simplest forms. Birds nested in trees, flowers unfolded in quiet defiance of the calendar, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth. I felt embedded in this world in a way I never had before. Not as a mother, grandmother, or caretaker, but as a fully realized individual. The independence I had carved for myself wasn't tea. just a personal victory. It had become a lens through which I could appreciate life's subtle joys. I began journaling regularly, capturing insights that had previously been lost in the noise of daily obligations. Words flowed freely, unburdened by expectation or fear of judgment. I wrote about regrets, victories, fears, and revelations, always circling back to one central truth. Life is fleeting, and clarity comes only when we claim our own space in it. The act of writing became a ritual, a way to cement my understanding that at any age, any stage, one can reshape life into something meaningful and intentional. On my 83rd birthday, I hosted a quiet gathering with friends who had become chosen family. There was laughter, reflection, and shared joy, not obligation. I realized then that life's richness is not measured by the people who leave us or the inheritance we receive, but by the courage to live authentically, to embrace the power of choice, and to cultivate peace within. The daughter who once criticized me, the family who abandoned me on New Year's night, had unwittingly gifted me the greatest inheritance imaginable: self-possession. In the quiet moments, I often returned to that night when everything changed. I remembered the loneliness, the hurt, and the uncertainty, but I also remembered the clarity it brought. I learned that life is not about avoiding pain, but transforming it into insight. It is about taking moments that seem insignificant, being alone, standing still, listening, and recognizing them as catalysts for profound change. That night had been less an ending and more a beginning, a doorway I had been too frightened to approach until I finally stepped through. Now, as I look back, I understand what truly matters. It is not wealth, not approval, not tradition. It is self-awareness, courage, and the ability to make choices that honor one's own spirit. It is kindness, curiosity, and the willingness to embrace life fully, without apology. The inheritance of freedom, respect, and dignity cannot be measured in material terms. It is earned through courage, reflection, and the decision to claim one's own life. I live now with intention, gratitude, and a profound sense of presence. I wake each day not with dread or obligation, but with anticipation for the small wonders waiting to be discovered. I no longer measure my worth by others' opinions or societal expectations. I have learned that life is richest when we prioritize authenticity over compliance, presence over performance, and connection over obligation. In this understanding lies a peace that is unshakable even when the world is chaotic. At 82, I finally realized what truly matters. I realized that life is not a gift to be measured, but a canvas to be painted with courage, choice, and joy. I understood that solitude can be a teacher, that abandonment can be a catalyst, and that freedom is not given, it is claimed. And in claiming it, I discovered the profound truth that had eluded me for decades. A greatest inheritance anyone can receive is the ownership of their own life, fully lived, fully embraced, and fully cherished.